Welcome back, and let us journey back in time. Let us leave the noise and hurry of our modern world behind and travel to an age of rolling green hills, dense, untamed forests, and the distant, reassuring toll of a monastery bell. An age where life was governed by the rising of the sun and the turning of the seasons. A world lit by candlelight and warmed by the hearth. This was the world of the Middle Ages, and at its very heart lay a system that ordered the lives of millions, from the mightiest king to the humblest farmer. A system of bonds, of loyalties, of land, and of service. We call it feudalism. The word itself might sound distant, academic, even complicated. But feudalism was not an abstract theory created by scholars. It was a living, breathing reality, born from the ashes of a fallen empire. It was a promise made between two men, a promise sealed not with ink, but with the clasp of hands and a sacred oath to God. It was a solution to the most fundamental problem of the time: how to find safety and order in a world filled with danger and chaos. It was the glue that held society together for centuries. Over the course of our journey tonight, we will explore this lost world in all its detail. We will untangle the intricate web of relationships that bound a knight to his lord, and a lord to his king. We will walk the fields of a medieval manor, understanding the life of the peasant whose labor fed the entire system. We will stand within the cold stone walls of a castle, learning its secrets as both a fortress and a home. We will examine the sacred vows, the military duties, the social structures, and the economic realities that defined an era. This is not a story of grand battles and famous kings, though they are a part of it. It is the story of a system, the very framework of a world. We will approach it calmly, piece by piece, so that the structure of this ancient society becomes clear in our mind's dot. So find a comfortable place and allow the story to unfold. Let the details of this forgotten age wash over you. Before we begin, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel to support our continued exploration of the past. And as we travel, consider this question: in a world without central government or police, what would you be willing to give up in exchange for protection for you and your family? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let us close our eyes to the modern day. The air grows cooler. The scent of wood smoke is on the wind. Our journey into the age of feudalism has begun. To understand why a system like feudalism came to be, we must first understand the world that preceded it. We must witness the breaking of the old world to see why a new one had to be built. For nearly 500 years, Western Europe had been united under the authority and protection of a single, colossal power, the Roman Empire. Rome was more than just a military conqueror. It was a system, an idea. It provided a common language, a unified code of laws, a sophisticated network of roads that stitched the continent together, and legions of soldiers that kept the frontiers secure. A farmer in Gaul, a merchant in Britannia, or a politician in Hispania all considered themselves Romans. They were part of a single, vast, and seemingly eternal civilization. The Roman peace, the Pax Romana, was the bedrock of this world. It guaranteed that a merchant could travel from the shores of the Mediterranean to the banks of the Rhine with a reasonable expectation of safety. It meant that cities were centers of trade, learning, and administration. not just fortresses. It meant there was a central authority to mint coins, to enforce contracts, and to fund the great works of public infrastructure, aqueducts, bridges, and highways that made a complex society possible. For centuries, this system, though not without its own violence and injustices, provided a level of stability and interconnectedness that Europe had never known before and would not know again for another 1,000 years. But in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, this great edifice began to crumble. The decline was not a single event, but a long, slow, agonizing process. The empire was assailed by a host of interlocking problems. Its economy was crippled by rampant inflation and excessive taxation. Its political system was paralyzed by endemic civil wars, with ambitious generals repeatedly marching on Rome to claim the title of emperor. The empire had grown too vast to be governed effectively from a single center, and its administrative machinery began to break down. The most visible and dramatic challenge, however, came from beyond its borders. A series of large-scale migrations by various Germanic and Asiatic peoples, often mistakenly referred to as barbarian invasions, put relentless pressure on the empire's frontiers. Groups like the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, and the Lombards, driven by their own internal pressures and the lure of Roman wealth, crossed the Rhine and Danube rivers, first as refugees and mercenaries, and later as conquerors. The Roman legions, stretched thin and plagued by internal loyalties, could no longer hold the line. The traditional date for the final collapse in the West is 476 A.D., the year the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus, Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. But in reality, the empire had been disintegrating for decades. The Vandals had sacked the city of Rome itself in 455. Britain had been abandoned by the legions long before that, left to fend for itself against the Angles and Saxons. Gaul was increasingly falling under the control of the Franks. The great unified system was shattering into 1,000 pieces. The disappearance of Roman central authority created a terrifying power vacuum. The consequences for the average person were catastrophic. The great Roman road network, no longer maintained by the state or patrolled by legions, fell into disrepair. More importantly, it became fantastically dangerous. Without soldiers, too. Keep order, the roads became the hunting ground of bandits and robber bands. Long-distance trade, which had been the lifeblood of the Roman economy, withered and died. It was no longer safe or profitable to move bulk goods like grain, wine, or pottery over long distances. The interconnected world of the Romans shrank as trade collapsed. So did the cities. Roman cities had been vibrant centers of commerce and administration. Now, with their trade routes severed and their administrative purpose gone, they began to empty out. People fled the cities to escape taxation, political instability, and the threat of attack. They sought refuge in the countryside, where they might at least be able to grow their own food. Great urban centers like Rome, which had a population of over 1 million at its height, shrank to a mere fraction of their former size. Stone from the great public buildings, the Colosseum, the forums, the temples, was scavenged to build defensive walls or private homes. The cities became dangerous, ghostly ruins of their former glory. The unified legal system vanished, replaced by a confusing patchwork of local customs and Germanic tribal laws. The sophisticated Roman monetary economy, based on a reliable supply of gold and silver coins, collapsed. Coins became scarce, and what little trade remained was often conducted through barter, the direct exchange of goods and services. Life became intensely local. A person's world shrank to their own village, their own valley, the distance one could walk in a single day. The concept of being part of a larger civilization, a res publica or public affair, faded from memory. It was replaced by a singular, overriding concern, survival dot in this fractured and dangerous new world. The only thing that mattered was security. People were not concerned with abstract ideas of citizenship or statehood. They were concerned with protecting their families and their crops from the bandits, marauding soldiers, or rival strongmen who roamed the land. Power was no longer held by distant emperors and senates. It was held by the local man who had the most swords at his command. A local warlord, a powerful landowner with a retinue of armed followers, became the only source of authority and protection. People willingly gave up their freedom in exchange for safety. A small, independent farmer, unable to protect himself, would turn to the local strongman. He would offer his land and his labor in exchange for the promise of protection. He would become the strong man's man, dependent on him for his family's survival. This was the fundamental transaction that lay at the heart of what would become feudalism. It was a desperate bargain, made in a world where the old certainties had dissolved into chaos. The Roman Empire did not fall and was then replaced by feudalism. Rather, in the slow, painful process of the empire's disintegration, the seeds of the feudal system began to sprout in the cracks. It was not a planned system, not an ideology imposed from above. It was an organic, almost instinctual response to the collapse of civilization. It was an attempt to create small pockets of order in a universe of disorder. The memory of Rome's peace and unity would haunt the European imagination for 1,000 years, a lost golden age to be endlessly mourned and emulated. But the reality on the ground was one of fragmentation, danger, and localization. Out of this rubble, a new kind of society based on personal bonds and military service would have to be built. The feudal system did not spring into existence overnight. It was a gradual evolution, a slow weaving of different threads, Roman traditions, Germanic customs, and Christian values into a new social fabric. But if we are to seek a specific crucible in which the key elements of feudalism were forged, we must turn our gaze to the kingdom of the Franks, the realm that would one day become France, and to a pivotal moment in the 8th century. It was here, in response to a new and terrifying military threat, that the central relationship of feudalism, the bond between a warrior and his lord, was institutionalized on a massive scale. The Franks had emerged from the collapse of the Roman Empire as the dominant power in Gaul. Their kings of the Merovingian dynasty ruled over a vast but often unstable kingdom. The true power, however, often lay not with the king, but with a powerful court official known as the mayor of the palace. In the early 8th century, this position was held by a man of extraordinary military and political talent, Charles, later known as Charles Martel or Charles the Hammer. Charles faced a formidable challenge. The nature of warfare itself was changing. For centuries, Frankish armies had been composed primarily of infantry freemen, who were obligated to answer the king's call to arms, fighting on foot with spears, axes, and shields. But a new form of warfare was proving devastatingly effective on the battlefields of the era: the heavy cavalryman. A warrior encased in armor, mounted on a powerful warhorse, and wielding a lance was the medieval equivalent of a tank. This kind of soldier could shatter an infantry line and dominate the battlefield. The rise of the mounted knight was a military revolution. This revolution, however, presented a serious problem. It was fantastically expensive. A warhorse alone cost a fortune, many times the price of a regular farm animal. It had to be specially bred and trained for the terror and chaos of battle. Then there was the armor: a helmet, a mail shirt or byrnie made of thousands of interlinked iron rings, greaves for the legs, and a shield. Add to this the cost of the weapons: a long, heavy sword, a lance, a dagger, and the total expense was far beyond the means of any ordinary freeman farmer. Furthermore, to be effective, a knight had to dedicate his entire life to the practice of war. He needed to spend his days training with his weapons and his horse, not plowing a field. Charles Martel needed an army of these elite professional soldiers. He needed to feel the force of heavy cavalry to counter the threats his kingdom faced, most notably the rapid advance of the Muslim armies of the Umayyad Caliphate, who had conquered Spain and were now pushing north across the Pyrenees. But how could he pay for it? The Frankish state had no meaningful system of taxation. The monetary economy was weak. He could not simply raise taxes to fund a standing army. He had to find another way. The solution he seized upon was ingenious, and it would become the cornerstone of the feudal system. The greatest source of wealth in the kingdom was not money, but land. The king, and by extension the mayor of the palace, controlled vast swaths of territory, including lands that had been confiscated from rebellious nobles or that belonged to the church. Charles began to grant large parcels of this land to warriors, who swore an oath to serve him as mounted soldiers. This grant of land was known as a benefice, and later, more commonly, as a fief. The man who received the land and swore the oath was known as a vassal. This was the heart of the feudal bargain. The lord, in this case Charles Martel, did not give the land to the vassal as a permanent, outright gift. He granted the vassal the right to use the land and to collect the income from it for the duration of his life. The income from the fief, the surplus crops produced by the peasants who lived on it, the fees from the local mill or wine press, was what supported the vassal. It paid for his warhorse, his armor, and his weapons. It freed him from the need to perform manual labor, allowing him to dedicate himself to military training. In return for this fief, the vassal owed his lord military service. He was obligated to appear for battle fully equipped and at his own expense whenever his lord called upon him. This system proved immensely successful. It allowed Charles Martel to create the powerful army of heavy cavalry he needed. At the pivotal Battle of Tours in 732, his Frankish army, which included a corps of these professional mounted warriors, decisively defeated the invading Umayyad forces, a victory that halted their northward expansion into Europe and earned Charles his nickname, the Hammer. The battle demonstrated the supreme effectiveness of heavy cavalry and cemented the military and social system that supported it. Under Charles Martel's grandson, The most famous ruler of the era, Charlemagne, this system was expanded and regularized. Across his vast Carolingian empire, Charlemagne required all his great nobles, his dukes and counts, to be his vassals. They, in turn, would grant portions of their own vast landholdings as fiefs to lesser warriors who would become their vassals. This process, known as Sabine feudation, created a chain of loyalty and military obligation that stretched from the emperor at the top down to the simple knight at the bottom. The bond between a lord and his vassal was intensely personal. It was not an impersonal contract with a distant state. It was a one-to-one relationship, a solemn promise between two individuals. The vassal was not just a soldier for hire. He was his lord's man. He owed his lord not just military service, but also loyalty, counsel, and aid. He was expected to attend his lord's court, to offer advice on important matters, and to help pay for certain special occasions, like the knighting of the lord's eldest son or the marriage of his eldest daughter. In return, the lord owed his vassal more than just the fief. He owed him protection. If the vassal's lands were attacked, the lord was obligated to come to his defense. He was also responsible for rendering justice for his vassal, presiding over disputes in his court. The relationship was meant to be one of mutual loyalty and support. It was a fusion of the old Roman idea of patronage, where a powerful man looked after his clients, and the Germanic tradition of the comitatus, where a war chief and his band of loyal warriors were bound together by oaths and a shared life of plunder and glory. This was the genesis of the feudal bond. It was a pragmatic solution to a military and economic problem. It created a decentralized, self-financing system for raising a professional army of knights. But it became much more than that. It became the fundamental organizing principle of the ruling class. It defined their social status, their political power, and their cultural values. This intensely personal, hierarchical system of land for service would, over the next 2 centuries, spread from its Frankish heartland to England, Spain, Italy, and the Crusader states, becoming the defining characteristic of the European Middle Ages. Feudalism is often visualized as a simple, neat pyramid. At the very peak sits the king, the ultimate owner of all the land in his kingdom. Below him are his most powerful nobles, the great dukes and counts, who hold their lands directly from him. Below them are the lesser lords and barons, who hold smaller fiefs from the great nobles. At the base of this pyramid of the elite are the knights, who hold only a single manor or a small estate, just enough to support themselves. And beneath all of them, forming the massive foundation upon which the entire structure rests, are the peasants, who are not part of the feudal system itself, but of the manorial system that supports it. This pyramid model is a useful starting point. It captures the essential hierarchical nature of the system, the idea of power and land flowing downwards from a single source in exchange for loyalty and service flowing upwards. It reflects a medieval belief in a divinely ordained social order where everyone had a specific place and a set of duties appropriate to their station. The king was at the top because he was chosen by God. The nobles were below him to help him rule and to defend the realm. The knights were there to fight, and the peasants were there to work. Each part was essential to the whole dot. Let us trace. the bonds of this idealized pyramid. The process would begin at the very top. A king, say the King of France, would grant a vast territory, a duchy, like Normandy or Aquitaine, to a powerful and trusted relative or ally. This man would become the Duke of Normandy and a direct vassal of the king. The Duke, in a grand ceremony, would perform homage and swear an oath of fealty to the king, promising him loyalty and military aid. But the Duke of Normandy could not possibly farm or manage this immense territory himself, nor could he single-handedly provide the large number of knights the king might demand. So he would divide his duchy into smaller units, called counties or baronies, and grant them as fiefs to his own chosen followers. These men would become his vassals, counts, and barons. They, in turn, would perform homage and swear fealty to the duke, promising him their personal loyalty and a certain quota of knights. The chain would continue downwards. A baron holding a substantial but not enormous territory would need his own retinue of knights to fulfill his obligation to the duke, so he would take a portion of his land, a parcel large enough to be considered a manor, and grant it as a fief to a warrior. This warrior would then become a knight, the baron's vassal. The knight would perform homage and swear fealty to the baron, promising to serve him in battle for a set number of days each year, typically 40. With the income from his manor, the knight could now afford the horse, armor, and weapons required of his station. He had entered the feudal elite, the warrior class. At its lowest rung dot in this perfect model, loyalty is straightforward. The knight owes loyalty to his baron, the baron to his duke, and the duke to the king. Power descends neatly and obligation ascends neatly. It is a clear chain of command, a perfect reflection of a structured and ordered universe. However, the reality of feudalism on the ground was far, far messier. The neat pyramid was, in practice, a tangled and often chaotic web of conflicting loyalties and personal ambitions. The first complication arose from the fact that a man could be a vassal to more than one lord. A knight, for instance, might accept a fief from Baron A and another, smaller fief from a neighboring Baron B. To whom did he owe his primary loyalty if Baron A and Baron B went to war with each other, a frequent occurrence? This was a genuine dilemma. To solve it, the concept of liege homage was developed. A vassal would declare one of his lords as his liege lord, the one to whom he owed his primary unbreakable allegiance. But even this was not a perfect solution, and the historical records are full of knights and nobles caught in impossible conflicts of interest. The problem became even more acute at the higher levels of the nobility. A powerful figure might be the duke of one territory, holding it from the King of France, but he might also be the count of another territory, which he held as a vassal from the Holy Roman Emperor. If France and the Empire went to war, where did his duty lie? His loyalties were not to a nation-state in the modern sense, but to the individual persons to whom he had sworn an oath. Furthermore, the bonds of vassalage did not automatically translate into effective royal control. The great nobles at the top of the pyramid, the dukes and counts, often became so powerful in their own right that they were kings in all but name. The Duke of Normandy or the Duke of Burgundy, for example, ruled their own territories, minted their own coins, held their own courts, and commanded vast armies of their own vassals. They might give a formal oath of fealty to the King of France, but in practice they often acted as independent rulers. Much of the political history of the Middle Ages is the story of kings struggling to assert their authority over these overmighty vassals who saw the king not as their master, an absolute sovereign, but simply as their highest-ranking feudal lord, a first among equals. The bonds could also be broken. While an oath of fealty was a sacred vow made on holy relics and before God, it could be renounced if a lord was deemed to have failed in his obligations to his vassal. A lord who failed to protect his vassal, who unjustly confiscated his land, or who made unreasonable demands, could be declared a tyrant. The vassal could then legally defy him, an act known as diffidatio. This right of defiance made the political landscape incredibly volatile, providing a legal justification for the near-constant rebellions and private wars that characterized the era. Finally, the pyramid model obscures the true nature of power. While theoretically all land came from the king, in reality, many powerful families owned their lands, known as allodial lands by ancient right of conquest and inheritance, not as a grant from a monarch. They were powerful in their own right, and a king often had to persuade them to become his vassals, not the other way around. The king was often less of an all-powerful puppet master at the top of the pyramid, and more like someone trying to herd a group of very powerful, very proud, and very heavily armed cats. So while the pyramid is a helpful image to begin with, we must remember it is an abstraction, a simplified diagram of a far more complex and dynamic reality. The true map of feudal power was not a neat triangle, but a messy, overlapping, and constantly shifting web of personal relationships. It was a system held together not by laws and institutions in the modern sense, but by individual oaths of loyalty, which were only as strong as the honor of the men who swore them and the power of the lords to enforce them. It was this intensely personal and therefore intensely unpredictable quality that made the feudal world so different from our own. At the very center of the feudal relationship, the tangible object that sealed the bargain between lord and vassal was the fief. The word itself, derived from old Germanic roots, came to signify the most important form of wealth and power in the medieval world. To understand feudalism, we must understand the true nature of a fief, for it was far more than just a piece of land. It was a complex bundle of rights, resources, and responsibilities. It was the economic engine that powered the entire system. When a lord granted a fief to his vassal, he was not simply handing over a deed to a plot of ground. The concept of private property, as we understand it today, the absolute and exclusive ownership of a piece of land, did not really exist for the medieval ruling class. Instead, feudalism was a system of land tenure, a way of holding land from someone else in exchange for service. The lord who granted the fief, the suzerain, still retained a superior interest in it. The vassal, in turn, did not own the fief. He held it. What he was granted was the right to its use and its income for as long as he fulfilled his feudal obligations. The most common form of a fief, and the one that formed the basis of the entire system, was the landed estate, most often a manor. A typical manor might consist of a village, a manor house or small castle for the night, and the surrounding farmland, meadows, and forests. The crucial point is that the fief did not just include the land itself, but also the people who lived and worked on it. The peasants, the serfs tied to the soil, were part of the package. The income of the fief came from their labor. The vassal was not expected to farm the land himself. He was a warrior. His income came from his right to command the labor of the peasants and to take a portion of their produce. The fief, therefore, was a grant of lordship. It gave the vassal the right to the agricultural surplus of the manor. This included a share of the crops grown by the peasants on their own strips of land, as well as the entire product of the domain, the land the lord reserved for his own direct use, which the peasants were obligated to farm for him for a certain number of days each week. But the income did not stop there. The fief also granted what were known as banal rights or banalities. These were monopolies that the lord held over essential services within the manor. For example, the peasants were typically forbidden from baking bread in their own homes. They were required to use the lord's oven and to pay a fee, usually a loaf of bread, for the privilege. They were forbidden from pressing their own grapes or olives. They had to use the lord's wine press or olive, press and pay a portion of the product as a fee. They were required to have their grain ground at the lord's mill, for which the miller, who worked for the lord, would take a share, known as the multure. The lord also had the right to charge tolls on any bridge he maintained or any road that passed through his land. These rights, which seem so exploitative to us, were a fundamental part of the fief's value. They were a steady source of income that helped the knight or lord pay for his expensive military equipment. The fief also came with judicial rights. The vassal was granted the right to hold a manorial court. He acted as the judge for the peasants living on his fief, settling disputes over property, punishing petty crimes like theft, and enforcing the labor obligations they owed him. This power of justice was another significant source of income, as fines were levied for various offenses. It also reinforced the lord's absolute authority over the lives of the people who were, for all practical purposes, his property. While a landed estate was the classic form of fief, it was not the only one. As the medieval economy slowly began to revive and become more complex, other types of fiefs emerged. A powerful lord might grant a vassal a money fief. This was the right to the income from a specific source, such as the tolls from a major bridge, the fees from a busy market, or a portion of the fines from a royal court. The lord would essentially assign this stream of revenue to his vassal in exchange for the usual promise of military service. This was particularly common in regions like Flanders, where the economy was more commercialized and cash was more readily available. There were also fiefs of office. A king might grant a high-ranking noble the hereditary position of butler or chamberlain or constable of the royal court. These were not just honorary titles. They came with significant political power and, crucially, a salary, often paid in the form of rights to certain royal revenues. This office, with its attendant income, would be held as a fief, with the holder owing service and loyalty to the king. The transfer of a fief from a lord to a vassal was a major public event, formalized in the ceremony of homage and fealty. After the oath was sworn, the lord would perform the act of investiture. He would hand his new vassal a symbolic object to represent the fief being granted. If it was a landed fief, this might be a clump of earth, a twig, or a banner. If it was a religious fief granted to a bishop or abbot, it might be a symbolic ring or staff. This physical act made the transfer of rights tangible and clear to everyone who witnessed it. Initially, fiefs were not hereditary, they were granted for the lifetime of the vassal. When the vassal died, the fief reverted back to the lord, who was then free to grant it to a new warrior of his choosing. However, over time it became customary for a lord to grant the fief to his deceased vassal's eldest son. This was not automatic. The son had to prove his loyalty, swear his own oath of homage, and most importantly, pay a substantial fee to the lord, known as a relief. This payment was a recognition of the fact that the lord was the true owner of the land and was doing the heir a favor by allowing him to inherit. If a vassal died leaving only a young child as an heir, the lord had the right of wardship. He would take control of the fief and all its income until the heir came of age, and he also had the right to arrange the heir's marriage, often selling it to the highest bidder. These rights were a major source of income for the nobility, and a frequent point of conflict. The fief then was the very heart of the feudal bargain. For the vassal, it provided the economic means to fulfill his role as an elite warrior, freeing him from labor and elevating him into the aristocracy. For the lord, it was the mechanism by which he could transform his primary asset land into military power. The entire social and political structure of the ruling class was built upon this system of holding land in exchange for service, a complex and evolving institution that shaped the destiny of the medieval world. In our modern world, agreements are solidified by paper. We rely on the written contract, a document filled with precise legal language, witnessed and signed and enforceable by a court of law. The medieval world, however, was largely an oral culture. While written charters and documents existed, particularly in the later Middle Ages, the primary means of sealing a solemn, binding agreement was through a public, ritualized ceremony. The bond between a lord and his vassal, the very cornerstone of the feudal system, was forged in one of the most powerful and symbolic rituals of the age, the ceremony of homage and fealty. This was no mere formality. It was a deeply personal and sacred act, a piece of political theater imbued with religious significance, performed in front of witnesses to make it a matter of public record. It was designed to be unforgettable, to sear the obligations of both parties into their memories and into the memory of the community. The ceremony typically took place in the Lord's Great Hall, the center of his power, before his court of other vassals and retainers. The ceremony consisted of 3 distinct parts: homage, the oath of fealty, and the investiture. The first part, homage, was the most symbolic and demonstrated the vassal's submission. The man seeking to become a vassal would approach the lord, unarmed and bareheaded, as a sign of his vulnerability and peaceful intent. He would then kneel before the seated lord, a powerful physical gesture of subordination. He would place his hands, palms together as if in prayer, between the hands of his lord. The lord would then enclose the vassal's hands within his own. This act, the immixtio manuum, or inmixing of hands, was the visual heart of the ceremony. It was an incredibly intimate gesture, symbolizing the vassal placing himself, his trust, and his service entirely into the lord's protection. While their hands were clasped, the vassal would make his formal declaration. The words varied slightly from place to place and time to time, But the intent was always the same. A 12th century text records a typical formula. Sire, I become your man from this day forward, of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and unto you shall be true and faithful, and bear you faith for the tenements that I claim to hold of you. He was declaring himself to be the Lord's man, from the Latin word homo, from which we get the term homage. This was the most profound commitment a free man could make to another. He was binding his very person to his Lord. The Lord would then accept his homage, often sealing the act with a kiss on the mouth, the osculum. This kiss of peace was not a romantic gesture, but a symbol of fellowship and the Lord's acceptance of the vassal into his inner circle. The second part of the ceremony was the oath of fealty. While homage created the personal bond, fealty defined the legal and moral obligations. After rising to his feet, the vassal would place his hand upon a holy relic, such as a piece of the true cross, the bone of a saint, or most commonly, the Bible itself. The presence of the holy relic was crucial. It meant that the oath was being sworn not just to the Lord, but directly to God. To break such an oath was not merely a breach of contract. It was a mortal sin, an act of perjury that would endanger the vassal's immortal soul. With his hand on the relic, the vassal would swear his loyalty. I promise on my faith, he might say, that I will be faithful to you against all men, and will uphold my service to you and to your holdings. So help me God and these holy relics. The word fealty comes from the Latin fidelitas, meaning faithfulness. This oath reinforced the promises of homage in the most solemn way imaginable. It elevated the feudal bond from a simple political or military arrangement to a sacred covenant. The Church, as the keeper of the relics and the arbiter of salvation, was thus woven into the very fabric of the feudal relationship, acting as its ultimate guarantor. The third and final part of the ceremony was the investiture, which we have touched upon. This was the Lord's part of the bargain, where he formally transferred the fief to his new vassal. The Lord would present a symbolic object to the vassal, a banner, a lance, a glove, a ring, or a clump of earth that represented the fief and all its attendant rights. This act completed the circle of reciprocity. The vassal had offered his loyalty and service. The Lord, in return, granted him land and protection. The deal was sealed. The obligations sworn in the oath of fealty were both negative and positive. The 11th century Bishop Fulbert of Chartres, in a famous letter, detailed what a vassal owed his lord. The negative obligations were things the vassal must not do. He must not injure his lord's body, betray his secrets, undermine his justice, damage his possessions, or make it difficult for him to do good. These were the basic requirements of faithfulness, but there were also positive obligations. The vassal owed his lord aid and counsel, auxilium et consilium. Counsel meant that the vassal was required to attend the Lord's court when summoned, to offer his advice on matters of war, law, and politics. This was the origin of the great councils that would eventually evolve into the parliaments of Europe. Aid was the most important obligation, and it primarily meant military service. The vassal was required to fight for his lord in person, for a specified period each year, typically 40 days. If the Lord needed him for a longer campaign, the Lord was usually expected to pay his expenses. Military aid could also include castle guard. the duty of serving in the garrison of the Lord's castle for a certain number of weeks per year. Financial aid was also required on certain special occasions. These feudal incidents were typically fourfold: to help pay the ransom if the lord was captured in battle, to help pay for the festivities when the lord's eldest son was knighted, to help pay for the dowry when the lord's eldest daughter was married, and sometimes to help pay for the lord to go on crusade. These payments were a crucial supplement to the lord's income. The ceremony of homage and fealty was the essential ritual that created and sustained the feudal order. It was a brilliant piece of social technology, perfectly adapted to its time. In a violent and uncertain world, it created a stabilizing network of personal allegiances. In an illiterate society, it used powerful, unforgettable gestures to make its meaning clear. And in a deeply religious age, it called upon God Himself to witness and sanctify the most important promise a man could make. It was this sacred vow, repeated in thousands of halls across Europe, that bound the warrior class together and formed the very skeleton of medieval society. At the heart of the feudal system, both its primary purpose and its most iconic symbol was the figure of the knight. The word conjures powerful images of a warrior in shining armor, a champion of justice, a rescuer of damsels. This romantic ideal, largely a creation of later medieval literature, holds a kernel of truth but masks a much more complex and often brutal reality. The knight was the professional, full-time warrior of the Middle Ages. He was the tooth and claw of the feudal order, the specialist in violence whose existence was made possible by the labor of hundreds of peasants, and whose primary function was to defend his lord's lands and to wage war upon his lord's enemies. The journey to knighthood was a long and arduous one, a lifelong apprenticeship that began in childhood. A boy destined for knighthood, typically the son of a lord or another knight, would not be raised at home. Around the age of 7 or 8, he would be sent away to the castle of his father's lord or another powerful nobleman to begin his education. This was not a cruel act of abandonment, but a vital part of the system. It strengthened the bonds between vassal families and exposed the boy to a wider world, teaching him the manners and values of the aristocracy. For the first several years he would serve as a page. His life was one of humble service, primarily to the lady of the castle. He would run errands, serve at the high table during meals, and learn the basics of courtly etiquette. He was taught to ride a horse, to handle a small sword, and to hunt with hawks and hounds, activities that were both a pastime for the nobility and a form of preliminary military training. He would learn to play chess, to sing, to play an instrument, and perhaps to read and write, though literacy was not considered an essential skill for a warrior. His most important lessons were in discipline, obedience, and service. Around the age of 14 or 15, if he had proven himself worthy, the page would graduate to the rank of squire. This was the second stage of his apprenticeship, and now his focus shifted entirely to the arts of war. He was assigned to a specific knight, becoming his personal assistant, his valet, and his student. The squire's duties were demanding. He was responsible for the care of his knight's most valuable possessions, his war horses or destriers, and his armor. He would spend hours polishing the mail, sharpening the sword, and ensuring every strap and buckle was in perfect condition. On The training ground the squire practiced relentlessly. He learned to wield the heavy, double-edged sword, the long, cumbersome lance, the battle axe, and the mace. He practiced fighting on foot and, most importantly, on horseback. He would charge at a quintin, a rotating dummy on a post, learning to strike it squarely with his lance without being knocked from his saddle by the swinging counterweight. He learned to manage a powerful war-horse in the chaos of a mock battle or melee. He accompanied his knight to tournaments, which were both a popular sport and a vital, if dangerous, form of large-scale military training. In actual battle, the squire would follow his knight, carrying spare weapons and a fresh horse, ready to assist him if he was unhorsed or wounded. He was an apprentice on the ultimate battlefield. If the squire survived these years of training and proved his courage and skill, he would finally be ready for the ultimate honor, to be made a knight himself. The ceremony of knighting, or dubbing, was one of the most significant moments in a man's life. In the early Middle Ages, it was often a simple battlefield affair. A lord would simply strike the squire on the shoulder with his hand or the flat of his sword, and declare, "Be thou a knight." But by the high Middle Ages, it had evolved into an elaborate religious and social ritual. The night before the ceremony, the squire would take a ritual bath, a symbol of purification. He would then spend the entire night in a vigil of prayer, in the castle chapel, kneeling before the altar on which his sword and armor had been placed to be blessed by a priest. This was the accolade, and it infused the act of knighting with a deep sense of Christian purpose. He was not just becoming a warrior, he was becoming a soldier of Christ. In the morning he would be dressed in his new armor by other knights and ladies of the court. He would swear an oath to be a good knight, to protect the weak, to defend the church, and to uphold justice. Finally, his lord would give him the coli, a blow to the neck or shoulder, and present him with his sword and spurs, the ultimate, symbols of his new rank. He was now Sir, a knight, a member of the European warrior elite. The code of conduct that was supposed to govern a knight's behavior is known as chivalry. This code was a complex mixture of military ethics, Christian morality, and courtly manners. A knight was expected to be brave in battle, prus, loyal to his lord, loyot, generous with his wealth, largesse, and courteous in his conduct, especially towards noble ladies. The ideal of chivalry was a powerful civilizing influence, an attempt by the church and society to tame the inherent violence of the warrior class and channel it towards more noble ends. The reality, however, was often very different. The chivalric ideal was just that, an ideal. Many knights were little more than violent thugs, greedy for land and plunder. They could be brutal to the peasants on their own manors and merciless to their enemies in war. The laws of chivalry, such as they were, often applied only to other members of the aristocracy. A knight might treat a captured enemy knight with courtesy and ransom him honorably, but he might feel no compunction about slaughtering hundreds of peasant foot soldiers. The romantic image of the knight-errant, wandering the land righting wrongs, was a fiction of the troubadours and poets. The real knight was a feudal vassal, whose primary job was to fight for the lord who paid him with a fief. The military function of the knight was what defined him. On the battlefield, a charge of disciplined heavy cavalry was the decisive tactical maneuver for centuries. A group of knights, known as a lance or a conroy, would charge in a tight formation, lances couched under their arms. The sheer kinetic energy of hundreds of armored men on powerful horses crashing into a line of infantry was enough to break almost any formation. Once the enemy line was broken, the knights would draw their swords and ride through the fleeing troops, cutting them down. It was a terrifyingly effective, but also very risky form of warfare. If the charge faltered, or if the knights became bogged down in mud or separated from one another, they were vulnerable to being pulled from their horses and killed by infantry. With daggers and polearms, the knight was the product of the feudal system, and in turn he was its enforcer. His castle was a symbol of his power, and his sword was the tool by which he maintained it. He was part of a transnational brotherhood of warriors, instantly recognizable by his armor and his spurs, whether he was in England, France, Germany, or the Holy Land. He lived a life of paradox. He was a Christian soldier sworn to protect the weak, yet his profession was violence. He was a cultured nobleman who enjoyed poetry and music, yet he was trained from childhood for brutal combat. He was the guardian of the medieval world, and also its greatest source of instability. No structure so completely dominates our mental image of the Middle Ages as the castle. Its stone towers and crenellated battlements are the quintessential symbols of the era, evoking a world of lords, ladies, knights, and sieges. But the castle was far more than just a backdrop for romantic stories. It was a vital and multifaceted institution, the stone heart of the feudal system. It was a military fortress designed for defense in a violent age. It was the administrative center of the fief, from which the lord governed his lands and his people. And it was a home, the private residence of the lord and his family, and a bustling center of social life. The castle was the ultimate expression of a lord's power, made manifest in timber and stone. The origins of the castle were functional and grim, born out of the chaos of the 9th and 10th centuries. With the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, Europe was beset by a new wave of invasions. Vikings raided from the north, Magyars from the east, and Saracens from the south. Central authority dissolved, and defense became an intensely local affair. Lords and even wealthy farmers needed to build fortified places of refuge for themselves, their families, and their communities. The first true castles, which appeared in northern France in the 10th century, were not the sprawling stone fortresses we imagine today. They were much simpler, cheaper, and faster to build, a type of structure known as the motte and bailey. The motte was a large earthen mound, either man-made or adapted from a natural hill. It could be of considerable height, sometimes over 100 feet. The earth was packed down tightly, and its sides were often covered in clay or reinforced with wooden planks. Atop this mound, a wooden tower or keep was constructed. This tower served as the lord's residence and the final point of defense. At the base of the motte was the bailey. This was a large enclosed courtyard surrounded by a wooden palisade fence, and beyond that a deep ditch or moat. The bailey was the center of the castle's daily life. It contained the necessary buildings for the lord's household and the administration of his fief, a great hall for dining and holding court, kitchens, stables, workshops for blacksmiths and carpenters, a chapel, and barracks for the garrison. In times of danger, the entire population of the local village, along with their livestock, could flee into the bailey for protection. The Motte and Bailey Castle was a brilliantly effective design. It used readily available materials, earth and timber, and could be erected relatively quickly. It offered excellent defensive advantages, with the high motte providing a commanding view and a formidable obstacle to attackers. For over 2 centuries, this was the dominant form of castle across much of Europe, including in England after the Norman conquest of 1066. By the 11th and 12th centuries, however, castle design began to undergo a profound transformation. As lords grew wealthier and more powerful, and as siege technology became more sophisticated, wood was gradually replaced by a more durable and fire-resistant material, stone. This stone revolution began with the keep. The wooden tower on the motte was replaced with a massive square stone tower, known as a Norman keep or a dungeon. These were formidable structures with walls many feet thick, designed to withstand assault. The famous White Tower at the Tower of London is a perfect surviving example. Soon, the wooden palisade around the bailey was also replaced with a high stone wall, known as a curtain wall. This wall was punctuated by projecting towers, which allowed defenders to shoot arrows down along the face of the wall, creating deadly enfilading fire against any attackers trying to scale it or break it down with a battering ram. The main entrance, always a weak point, was heavily fortified into a massive gatehouse, protected by 1 or 2 portcullises, heavy iron grates that could be dropped down and murder holes in the ceiling through which defenders could drop stones, boiling water, or quicklime on anyone who managed to get inside. The ultimate evolution of castle design was spurred by the experience of the Crusades. European knights who traveled to the Holy Land encountered the sophisticated military architecture of the Byzantine and Arab worlds. They saw castles with multiple layers of concentric walls, massive circular towers that were more resistant to siege engines, and ingenious layouts designed to trap and disorient attackers. They brought these ideas back to Europe, leading to the great concentric castles of the 13th century, like Caernarfon in Wales or the Crac des Chevaliers in Syria. These were not just single fortresses, but complex defensive systems designed to be held by a small garrison against a much larger army for months or even years. The primary purpose of the castle was military. It was a defensive structure designed to allow a lord to control the surrounding territory with a relatively small number of soldiers. It provided a secure base for launching raids against his enemies and a refuge in case of attack. A well-built, well-stocked castle was incredibly difficult to capture. An attacking army had few options. They could try a direct assault, using ladders to scale the walls or a battering ram to break down the gate. But this was incredibly costly in human lives. The defenders on the walls, protected by the battlements, had all the advantages, raining down arrows, crossbow bolts, and rocks on the exposed attackers below. The other option was a long siege. The army would surround the castle, cut off its supply lines, and try to starve the defenders into submission. This could take many months and required the attacking army to have a secure supply line of its own. Attackers could also employ sophisticated siege engines. The trebuchet, a massive counterweight-powered catapult, could hurl enormous stones with enough force to breach even thick stone walls. Miners could try to dig a tunnel or sap underneath a wall or tower and then collapse the tunnel, bringing the fortification down. The history of medieval warfare is a constant technological arms race between the art of castle building and the art of siegecraft. But the castle was not just a military machine. It was the administrative heart of the fief. It was from the great hall of the castle that the lord or his steward, the reeve, managed the estate. It was here that the manorial court was held, where disputes were settled and justice was dispensed. It was here that tenants came to pay their rents and dues. The castle's dungeons held prisoners, and its storerooms held the surplus grain and wealth of the manor. The castle was the visible, intimidating symbol of the lord's authority to all who lived on his lands. It was also a home. Life in a medieval castle was often cold, dark, and drafty, but it was also the center of the noble social world. The lord, his lady, their children, their household knights, and their many servants all lived within its walls. The great hall was the hub of this life, a cavernous, multi-purpose room where everyone ate together, where court was held, where guests were entertained by traveling minstrels and troubadours, and where much of the household slept at night on straw pallets. The lord and his lady might have a private chamber, the solar, which was often the only room with a private fireplace and a large window, a rare luxury. The ladies of the castle would spend their days managing the vast and complex household, weaving, doing embroidery, and overseeing the education of the pages. The castle was a hive of constant activity, a microcosm of the medieval social order. The castle was the anchor of the feudal world. It was a physical manifestation of the system's core principles: power, protection, and lordship. Its stone walls represented the stability and order that the local lord provided in a dangerous world, an order for which the peasants paid with their labor and the knights with their military service. The rise and fall of the castle mirrors the rise and fall of feudalism itself. As kings grew more powerful and gunpowder artillery made even the strongest stone walls obsolete, the military purpose of the castle declined. They slowly transformed from stark fortresses into comfortable country palaces. But their ruins, scattered across the European landscape, remain as powerful and enduring monuments to the age of lords and vassals. If the castle was the stone heart of the feudal system, then the manor was its economic lifeblood. While feudalism describes the relationship between the king and his warrior elite, the manorial system, or manorialism, describes the relationship between those warriors and the vast majority of the population, the peasants who actually worked the land. The two systems were inextricably linked, two sides of the same coin. The manor was the agricultural estate that was granted as a fief to a lord or knight, and its wealth, derived from the relentless labor of its inhabitants, was what made the entire feudal structure of knights, castles, and warfare possible. To understand the daily reality of the Middle Ages for 9 out of 10 people, we must leave the great hall of the castle and walk out into the fields of the manor. A typical manor was a largely self-sufficient world unto itself. Its goal was not to produce a large surplus for export, but to provide for the subsistence of its own population, and to generate the income needed to support its lord. Geographically, a manor consisted of a village, the surrounding farmland, and other essential resources. The center of the village would be the parish church, often the only stone building, other than the manor house itself. Clustered around it would be the peasants' simple homes called cruck houses, built of timber wattle and daub, a mixture of woven lattice, mud, and straw, and topped with a thatched roof. These homes were small, dark, and smoky, often consisting of just 1 or 2 rooms, which was shared by the entire family, and in the winter, their precious livestock. The land of the manor was divided in a very particular way. A significant portion, often up to 1/3 of the best land, was the lord's demesne. This was the lord's private land, and its produce belonged entirely to him. The rest of the arable land was divided among the peasants, but they did not have consolidated farms as we would imagine them today. Instead, the manor's farmland was typically organized into 2 or 3 enormous open fields. Each of these great fields was then subdivided into a multitude of long, narrow strips, usually an acre or half an acre in size. A single peasant family would not work a single block of land. Instead, they would hold a number of these strips scattered throughout the great fields. A family might hold 15 or 20 strips in total, but they would be spread all over the manor. This system, though it seems inefficient to us, was designed to ensure a fair distribution of both the good and the poor quality land among all the tenants. The agricultural cycle dictated the rhythm of life. The manor typically practiced a 2-field, or more advanced, a 3-field system of crop rotation. In a 3-field system, 1 field would be planted in the autumn with wheat or rye. The second field would be planted in the spring with oats, barley, or legumes like peas and beans. The third field would be left fallow, unplanted for a year, to allow the soil to recover its nutrients. The peasants' livestock would be allowed to graze on the fallow field, their manure helping to fertilize it for the next year's planting. This system was a crucial agricultural innovation that increased food production and provided a more varied diet beyond the arable fields. The manor also contained other vital resources held in common. The meadow was particularly important, as it provided the hay needed to feed the livestock through the winter. The commons was an area of pasture land where all the peasants had the right to graze their animals. The surrounding forest or woodland was also a critical resource, providing timber for building and fuel, and a place for the lord to hunt, and for the peasants to forage for nuts, berries, and to graze their pigs on acorns. However, the peasants' rights in these areas were strictly limited. They could only take a certain amount of wood, and poaching the lord's deer was a crime punishable. By death, the population of the manor was divided into several social categories. The lord of the manor himself, the knight or baron who held it as a fief, might reside there in his manor house or small castle. Or, if he held multiple manors, he might be an absentee lord, visiting only occasionally to collect his revenues, leaving the day-to-day administration to a steward or a reeve. The reeve was a particularly important figure, a peasant chosen to supervise the work on the manor, a medieval foreman. The peasants themselves were not a uniform group. There was a distinction between free peasants and unfree peasants or serfs. A freeman was a tenant who, while he owed rent and dues to the lord, was not legally bound to the land. He had some rights and could, in theory, leave the manor if he chose, though in practice this was very difficult. The majority of the population, however, were serfs. The word serf comes from the Latin servus, meaning slave, and while a serf was not technically a slave, his condition was not far from it. A serf was bound to the land by law. He could not leave the manor without the Lord's permission. He could not marry or have his daughter marry someone from outside the manor without the Lord's consent and the payment of a fee called a merchant. He could not inherit his family's land strips without paying a heriot, often the best animal he owned, to the Lord. He and his children were, for all intents and purposes, the property of the Lord of the Manor in return for their small strips of land. All peasants, both free and serf, owed the Lord a formidable array of dues and labor services. The most important of these was week work. For 2 or 3 days every week, every peasant family had to send a worker to labor on the Lord's domain, planting, plowing, weeding, or harvesting his crops. This was unpaid compulsory labor. During peak times like the harvest, the peasants also owed boon work, extra days of labor to ensure the Lord's crops were brought in quickly. In addition to this labor, they owed a portion of their own harvest as rent, paid in kind with bushels of wheat, chickens, or eggs. They also had to pay the tithe, a tenth of their produce, to the local parish church. And on top of all this, they were subject to the Lord's monopolies, the banal rights, paying fees to use his mill, his oven, and his wine-press. Life for a peasant was a constant struggle for survival, a life of back-breaking labor from sunrise to sunset. Their diet was simple and monotonous, consisting mostly of dark bread, pottage, a thick vegetable stew, cheese, and ale. Meat was a rare luxury. They were at the mercy of the weather. A single hailstorm or a summer drought could mean the difference between subsistence and starvation. They were also at the mercy of their lord, whose demands could be arbitrary and crushing. The manor was a system of organized extraction, designed to channel the wealth produced by the many into the hands of the few. It was a profoundly unequal and exploitative system, but it was also a stable and enduring one. It provided the peasant with access to land and a small degree of security in a dangerous world. It was this engine of agricultural production, this world of the manor, that supported the entire glittering, violent, and pious superstructure of the feudal age. The great narrative of the Middle Ages, as it is often told, is one of kings and popes, of knights and crusades, of soaring cathedrals and epic poems. But this is the story of the 1%, the overwhelming reality for the vast majority of people. For more than 9 out of every 10 individuals was a life lived on the land, a life of relentless, back-breaking labor, governed not by politics or chivalry, but by the turning of the seasons and the demands of the harvest. To truly understand the medieval world, we must try to imagine what it was like to be a peasant, a member of the great Third Estate, the order of those who worked, upon whose shoulders the entire society rested. The peasant's world was both small and immense. It was small in its geographical scope. For most, their entire existence would play out within the confines of their manor, their village, and its surrounding fields. A journey to the next town was a major event. The wider world of kingdoms and empires was a distant rumor, something heard from a traveling peddler or a priest. Yet their world was immense in its connection to the cosmos. They lived under a vast and open sky, acutely aware of the movement of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the changing of the constellations. Their lives were intimately bound to the natural world, to the feel of the soil, the direction of the wind, and the smell of the coming rain. The peasant's year was a cycle of toil, each season bringing its own demanding tasks. The year began in the depths of winter in what was known as the Hungry Gap. The harvest was long gone, and the stores of grain were dwindling. There was little work to be done in the frozen fields. It was a time of cold, darkness, and anxiety. The family would huddle in their small, smoky hut, mending tools, weaving rough cloth, and praying that their food would last until the spring dot. As the days lengthened and the ground thawed, the frantic work of spring began. This was plowing season. The peasant would yoke his precious oxen, or if he was more fortunate, a horse, to the heavy wheeled plow and spend day after day carving furrows into the manor's great open fields. Plowing was exhausting work for both man and beast, a slow, plodding struggle against the earth. Once the fields were plowed, it was time for sowing. The peasant would walk the furrows with a sack of seed grain, carefully broadcasting the seeds by hand, a skill that required practice and judgment. He had to save enough seed from the previous harvest to plant for the next, a constant source of worry. Summer brought its own labors. The fields of hay had to be mown with long scythes, then raked and left to dry before being gathered into haystacks. The hay was a vital resource, the primary food for the livestock during the coming winter. The growing crops of wheat and barley had to be constantly weeded, a tedious task usually performed by the women and children. This was also the time for shearing the sheep, whose wool was the primary source of fiber for clothing. Then came the climax of the agricultural year, the harvest or reaping. This was a period of intense communal labor that involved every able-bodied man, woman, and child in the village. The grain had to be cut with sickles, bound into sheaves, and carted from the fields to be threshed. Threshing involved beating the sheaves with a flail to separate the grain from the stalk. It was all done under immense pressure. The entire year's food supply depended on bringing the harvest in safely before it could be ruined by rain. During this period, the lord could demand extra boon work, and the peasants would labor from before dawn until after dusk, first on the lord's domain, and then on their own scattered strips. Autumn was the season for plowing and planting the winter crops, for collecting firewood from the forest, and for slaughtering the livestock that could not be fed through the winter. The meat would be salted or smoked to preserve it. It was also the time for brewing ale and making cider from the apple harvest. And then, as the days grew short and cold, the cycle would begin again. The peasant's home was a simple and often squalid affair. The typical hut was built around a curved timber frame, a cruck, with walls made of wattle and daub, and a roof of thick thatch. There were no windows, only small openings that could be covered with wooden shutters, and the floor was simply packed earth, perhaps strewn with reeds or straw to absorb the mud and waste. In the center of the main room was an open hearth for cooking and for warmth. With no chimney, the smoke simply filtered out through the thatch, filling the room with a constant haze that stung the eyes and blackened the walls. The furniture was sparse and crude. A rough table, some stools, and a chest for storing valuables. The family slept together on straw mattresses, often sharing their cramped living space with their chickens, a pig or a calf whose body heat helped to warm. The hut during the winter their diet was as monotonous as their labor. The staple of their existence was bread not the light, white bread of the nobility, but a dark, heavy loaf made from rye or a mixture of grains called maslin. This was supplemented by a daily pot of pottage, a thick porridge-like stew, made from whatever vegetables were available: peas, beans, onions, cabbage, and thickened with oats. They might have some cheese from their own cow or goat, and eggs from their chickens. Meat was a rare treat, usually only eaten on major feast days. Their primary drink was ale or small beer, which was safer to drink than water from the often contaminated streams and wells. It was a diet high in carbohydrates and fiber, but often deficient in essential vitamins and protein, leading to chronic malnutrition and diseased diet. Despite this life of hardship, the peasant's world was not entirely without joy or respite. The church calendar provided a framework of holidays and feast days that broke the monotony of labor. Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun were major celebrations, times of feasting, drinking, and games. There were village festivals to mark the turning of the seasons, like May Day, with its dancing and revelry. The village church was the center of social as well as spiritual life. It was here that people were baptized, married, and buried. It was at the Sunday service that they heard news from the outside world and socialized with their neighbors. The church ale, a festive parish fundraising event, was a highlight of the year. The peasant was not a passive victim. They had a rich culture of folk stories, songs, and proverbs, passed down orally from generation to generation. They had a deep, if unorthodox, faith, a mixture of official Christian doctrine and older pagan superstitions about the spirits of the woods and fields. And they were not without agency. While a full-scale revolt was rare and brutally suppressed, peasants had their own ways of resisting the Lord's authority. They could work slowly on the domain lands, feign illness, or hide a portion of their harvest to avoid paying the full rent. The records of the manorial courts are filled with cases of peasants being fined for these small but significant acts of defiance. They were engaged in a constant, low-level struggle to protect their own interests and to carve out a small space of autonomy in a system designed to control them. To be a peasant in the Middle Ages was to live a life on the edge of precarious existence, defined by hard labor, constant obligation, and the ever-present threat of famine and disease. It was a life of profound inequality and constraint. Yet it was also a life lived with a deep sense of community, a powerful connection to the natural world, and a resilient spirit that enabled them to endure, to raise families, and to find moments of joy and celebration in the midst of hardship. It was their silent, anonymous toil, repeated generation after generation, that formed the true and lasting foundation of the medieval world. In our modern, largely secular age, we tend to think of social structures, politics, economics, and religion as separate and distinct spheres. In the Middle Ages, no such separation existed. The Catholic Church was not simply an institution concerned with Sunday worship and the salvation of souls. It was an all-encompassing power that permeated every aspect of medieval life. It was a spiritual authority, a political force, a cultural unifier, and, most importantly for our story, one of the greatest landowners in all of Europe. As such, the Church was not just a witness to the feudal system. It was a central and powerful player within it, a great feudal lord in its own right. The spiritual authority of the Church was absolute and unquestioned. It was the sole gateway to heaven, the dispenser of the sacraments that marked every stage of a person's life, from baptism at birth to the last rites at death. The local parish priest in the village and the powerful bishop in his cathedral city held immense sway over the hearts and minds of the populace. The threat of excommunication, of being cast out of the church and thus denied the possibility of salvation, was a terrifying weapon that could bring even the proudest king or most rebellious noble to his knees. This spiritual power formed the backdrop against which all feudal relationships were sworn. As we have seen, the oath of fealty was a sacred vow, made on holy relics and guaranteed by God. The Church acted as the ultimate guarantor of the feudal contract, lending its immense moral authority to the bonds of loyalty between lord and vassal. But the Church's role went far beyond the spiritual. It was also a massive economic and political institution. Through centuries of pious donations from kings, nobles, and commoners seeking to secure their place in the afterlife, the Church had accumulated vast amounts of land. It is estimated that by the High Middle Ages, the Church owned as much as a third of all the land in Western Europe. This made the Church, collectively, the largest single landowner on the continent. And in a society where land was the basis of all power, this made the Church a formidable political entity. These vast church lands were organized in much the same way as secular lands. A great monastery or a cathedral chapter would control dozens of manors, each with its villages, its fields, and its population of serfs. This meant that the Church was deeply enmeshed in the manorial system. An abbot of a powerful monastery or a bishop of a wealthy diocese was, for all intents and purposes, a great feudal lord. They had to manage their estates, collect their rents and dues, and preside over their manorial courts, just like any secular duke or baron. The peasants who lived on church lands owed their labor and their loyalty not to a knight, but to a monastery or a cathedral. Life for a serf on a church manor was often no different, and sometimes even harsher, than for a serf on a secular one. The Church, as an institution, was a landlord, and it acted like one, seeking to maximize the income from its vast agricultural holdings. Because the Church was a great landowner, it was also a key player in the feudal system of military obligation. According to feudal principles, all land was held in exchange for service, and that service was primarily military. What, then, did the Church owe the king or the great nobles for its vast territories? Bishops and abbots could not, of course, ride into battle themselves. The code of canon law forbade a cleric from shedding blood, but this did not exempt them from their feudal duties. A bishop or abbot who held his lands as a fief from the king was a royal vassal, and he owed the king the service of a certain number of knights. To fulfill this obligation, the bishop or abbot would act just like a secular lord. He would grant some of his church's manors as fiefs to knights, who would become his vassals. These knights would swear an oath of fealty to the bishop and would be obligated to fight for the king whenever the bishop was called upon to provide them. So a great prelate of the Church, like the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Bishop of Durham, would have his own retinue of household knights and a whole host of knightly vassals, making him a powerful military figure, even if he never drew a sword himself. This created a class of clergy who were as much politicians and administrators as they were spiritual leaders, men who were deeply involved in the worldly affairs of war, power, and land management. This deep integration of the church into the feudal system created a number of profound tensions. The most significant of these was the issue of lay investiture. Who had the right to appoint a bishop or an abbot? Was it the Pope as the spiritual head of the church? Or was it the king or emperor from whom the bishop would hold his vast lands as a fief? For centuries, secular rulers insisted on their right to invest new bishops with the ring and staff, the symbols of their spiritual office, effectively choosing the leaders of the church within their realms. They often chose men not for their piety, but for their political loyalty or for the large sums of money they were willing to pay. This practice was seen as a deep corruption by a series of reform-minded popes in the 11th century, most notably Pope Gregory VII. He argued that the church must be free from secular control, that bishops were servants of God, not vassals of kings. This led to a titanic struggle between the papacy and the secular monarchs of Europe, known as the investiture controversy. It was a conflict that would dominate European politics for over 50 years, featuring dramatic excommunications, depositions, and full-scale wars. The eventual compromise, the Concordat of Worms in 1122, decreed that bishops would be chosen by the church but would then have to swear homage to the king for their temporal lands. It was a complex solution that highlighted the inescapable entanglement of spiritual and feudal authority. The church also served as one of the few avenues for social mobility in the rigidly stratified medieval world. A bright peasant boy could, with luck and a patron, enter the church as a novice monk or a parish priest. If he was talented and ambitious, he could potentially rise through the ranks. Men from humble origins could and did become bishops, cardinals, and even, in rare cases, pope. The church was a parallel hierarchy to the feudal one, and a career in its service offered an alternative path to power and influence for those who were not born into the warrior aristocracy. In its role as a feudal lord, a political power, and a spiritual authority, the church was the great, unifying thread of the Middle Ages. It was woven so deeply into the political and economic fabric of feudalism that it is impossible to imagine one without the other. It provided the moral justification for the system, acted as one of its most powerful players, and was often the source of its deepest conflicts. The twin pyramids of feudal and ecclesiastical power stood side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, but always intertwined, defining the landscape of the medieval world. The feudal system, for all its seeming rigidity and its deep roots in the soil of medieval Europe, was not a static or monolithic entity. It was a dynamic and constantly evolving set of relationships, riddled with internal contradictions and subject to external pressures. For centuries it provided a framework for social order and military organization, but from its very inception it contained the seeds of its own transformation. By the High Middle Ages, from the 12th century onwards, a series of developments began to expose the strains in the system, creating cracks in the armor of the old feudal world, and paving the way for a new kind of society. One of the most fundamental strains was the inherent conflict between the king at the top of the pyramid and his powerful vassals just below him. The theory of feudalism held that the great dukes and counts were the king's loyal vassals, but the reality was often one of intense rivalry. A king's primary political objective was to increase his own power and centralize control over his kingdom. The objective of his great nobles was often the exact opposite, to maintain their own regional autonomy and to resist the king's encroachments on their power. This created a constant state of political tension, which frequently erupted into open warfare. The history of medieval France, for example, is largely the story of the Capetian kings struggling to assert their authority over their powerful and often rebellious vassals, like the Dukes of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Burgundy. These nobles were not fighting to overthrow the king, but to ensure that he remained what they believed he was supposed to be, a distant overlord, not an absolute master. The complex and overlapping web of personal loyalties also created endless instability. As we have seen, a single nobleman could hold fiefs from multiple lords, leading to impossible conflicts of interest. The classic example of this is the unique position of the kings of England after the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror was the king of England in his own right, a sovereign monarch. But he was also the Duke of Normandy, a fief which he held as a vassal from the King of France. This made the King of England one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, legally obligated to perform homage and swear fealty to the King of France. This absurd and humiliating situation was a recipe for perpetual conflict, and it was the direct cause of the series of wars between England and France that would dominate the Middle Ages, culminating in the 100 Years' War. At the same time, as these internal political tensions were playing out, a slow but profound economic and social change was beginning to undermine the very foundations of the old feudal and manorial order, the revival of towns and trade. Beginning in the 11th century, Europe's population began to grow. Agricultural techniques improved, and a small but significant surplus of food was created. This surplus helped to fuel a resurgence of long-distance trade. Old Roman cities began to reawaken, and new towns sprang up at key crossroads, river crossings, and natural harbors. These towns were alien bodies within the feudal world. They were centers of commerce, not agriculture. Their inhabitants were merchants, artisans, and craftsmen, not warriors or peasants. Their wealth was in money, not land. The towns did not fit neatly into the tripartite social order of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. They represented a new fourth category, those who trade. The air of the town, as a medieval proverb went, makes one free. A serf who managed to escape from his manor and live within a town's walls for a year and a day was legally declared a free man, no longer bound to his lord. The towns became magnets for ambitious and desperate people, offering a new path to freedom and prosperity. The townspeople, or burghers, had little use for the feudal system. Their interests were in stable currencies, safe trade routes, and the freedom to run their own affairs without the interference of a local lord. They began to band together into associations called communes, and they used their collective wealth to purchase charters of liberty from the local king or great noble. These charters granted them the right to govern themselves, to have their own courts, to levy their own taxes, and to be exempt from the arbitrary dues and services of the manorial system. They were, in effect, creating small islands of commercial freedom in the midst of a feudal sea. The rise of a money economy, nurtured by the towns, had a corrosive effect on the old feudal relationships. The feudal system was based on land and service, but as money became more common, the old bonds began to be commuted for cash payments. A vassal, instead of performing his 40 days of military service, might offer to pay his lord a sum of money instead. This payment was known as scutage or shield money. For the vassal, it meant he could avoid the risks and expenses of a military campaign. For the lord, and particularly for the king, this was an attractive proposition. A king who collected scutage from many of his vassals could use that money to hire professional soldiers or mercenaries. Mercenaries had several advantages over feudal levies. They would fight for as long as they were paid, not just for 40 days. Their loyalty was to their paymaster, not to a complex web of feudal allegiances. A king with a paid professional army was a much more powerful figure than one who had to rely on the grudging and temporary service of his rebellious vassals. The increasing use of mercenaries slowly made the old feudal system of raising an army obsolete. If a lord's primary value to the king was his ability to provide knights, what was his purpose when the king could simply buy an army? The very nature of warfare was also changing in ways that diminished the dominance of the knight. The development of the longbow, as demonstrated by the English in battles like Crécy and Agincourt, showed that disciplined infantry archers could defeat a charge of heavy French cavalry. The increasing use of pikes by Swiss and Flemish infantry also proved that a well-trained wall of foot soldiers could be a formidable obstacle to mounted warriors. Finally, the slow but steady introduction of gunpowder in the 14th and 15th centuries would signal the final death knell for both the knight and his castle. A cannon could do what a trebuchet never could. It could reliably batter down the strongest stone walls, rendering the castle an obsolete defense. These were the strains that were pulling the old system apart from within. The political conflicts between kings and nobles, the economic revolution of the towns and the money economy, and the military revolution that was marginalizing the knight. All these factors were working to dissolve the old bonds of homage and fealty. The feudal system did not collapse overnight. It was a slow, uneven process of decline and adaptation. But by the 14th century, the cracks in the armor were clear for all to see. The world was becoming more centralized, more commercial, and more complex. A new kind of society was emerging, one that had less need for a system born in the chaos of a fallen empire. The feudal system was not felled by a single decisive blow. It did not have a neat and tidy end date. Instead, it underwent a long, slow, and complex decline, a process of fading away that stretched over several centuries. The internal strains. We have discussed the rise of towns, the money economy. The changing nature of warfare had been gradually weakening its foundations for generations. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, a series of catastrophic events and profound structural changes acted as powerful accelerators, hastening the transition from the medieval to the early modern world, and consigning the classic feudal order to the pages of history. The first and most devastating of these events was the Black Death, the Great Plague, which swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, wiped out between a third and a half of the continent's population. This demographic catastrophe had a revolutionary impact on the manorial system, the economic engine of feudalism. The medieval economy was based on a huge supply of cheap labor and a scarcity of land. The plague radically inverted this equation. Overnight, suddenly land was plentiful and labor was scarce. This had a number of profound consequences. At the base of the social pyramid, the surviving peasants found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. Lords of the manor, desperate for workers to till their fields, were forced to compete with one another for tenants. They began to offer better terms, lower rents, and greater freedoms to attract laborers. The old system of unpaid labor service, the weak work on a lord's domain, began to collapse. Peasants were no longer willing to work for free when they could demand a wage for their labor. Serfdom, the institution that bound peasants to the land, withered away across much of Western Europe. A serf could simply run away from his manor, confident that another lord would welcome him as a free, wage-earning tenant. The old manorial obligations were replaced by cash rents, transforming the relationship between lord and peasant from one of personal servitude to a more impersonal, economic contract. This severed the very roots of the old order. For the land-owning nobility, the warrior class, the Black Death was an economic disaster. Their wealth was based on the labor of their peasants. With half their workforce dead and the survivors demanding wages, their incomes plummeted. Many lesser knights and lords, who had already been struggling to keep up with the rising costs of armor and horses, were pushed into bankruptcy. They were forced to sell their lands, often to wealthy merchants from the cities or to the king himself. This led to a consolidation of land and power in the hands of the monarchy and the nascent urban bourgeoisie, further weakening the traditional feudal aristocracy. The second great accelerator of change was the increasing scale and intensity of warfare. Most notably the 100 Years' War between England and France, which raged intermittently from 1337 to 1453. This was not a typical feudal conflict of short campaigns and limited goals. It was a long, grinding national struggle that required large, permanent, and professionally organized armies. Kings could no longer rely on the 40-day service of their feudal vassals. They needed soldiers who would fight for months or years on end, and they needed them in large numbers. To meet this need, kings on both sides relied increasingly on paid professional soldiers. They developed systems of national taxation to raise the vast sums of money required to fund these armies. The French monarchy, for instance, established a permanent tax, the taille, to pay for a standing army of professional soldiers, the Compagnies d'Ordnance. This was a revolutionary step. It meant that the king now had a military force that was loyal directly to him as the head of the state, not to a collection of individual feudal lords. The state was now taking over the primary function of the feudal nobility, the defense of the realm. The nobles were still important military leaders, serving as officers in the king's army, but their role as the semi-independent providers of military force was gone. They were becoming subjects of the king, rather than his partners in power. The development of gunpowder technology, particularly effective artillery, finalized this military transformation. In the 15th century, cannons became powerful enough to shatter the walls of even the strongest medieval castle. The fortress that had been the ultimate symbol of the feudal lord's independence and power was now vulnerable. A king with a train of artillery could subdue any rebellious noble who dared to defy him. the castle ceased to be a viable military defense and slowly transformed into an unfortified country residence, a palace rather than a stronghold. The age of the independent, castle-dwelling warrior lord was overdought as the military and economic foundations of feudalism eroded. So too did its cultural and social justifications. The code of chivalry, which had once been the defining ethos of the warrior class, fell into decline. The disastrous French defeat at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where thousands of French knights were slaughtered by English longbowmen, was seen by many as a moral failure of the chivalric ideal. The nobility was increasingly seen not as the noble protectors of society, but as a privileged and often corrupt class, out of touch with the new realities of the world. By the end of the 15th century, the classic feudalism of the Middle Ages was essentially dead. In its place, a new kind of political organization was emerging, the centralized nation-state. Kings like Louis XI in France, Henry VII in England, and Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain were consolidating their power, creating professional bureaucracies, imposing national taxes, and fielding national armies. The nobility was being transformed from a class of semi-independent warriors into a class of courtiers, landowners, and state officials, their power now dependent on their relationship with the monarch rather than on their own feudal levies. Legacy of feudalism, however, lingered for centuries. The system left an indelible mark on the European landscape, its laws and its social structures. In France, the formal privileges of the nobility and the last vestiges of manorial dues were not officially abolished until the French Revolution in 1789. In Russia, serfdom lasted until 1861. The language of feudalism, with its concepts of lords, tenants, and homage, still echoes in our property law today. Feudalism was a response to a specific set of historical circumstances, the collapse of central authority, and the need for local protection in a violent and fragmented world. It was a system that, for all its profound inequalities, managed to hold society together and provide a degree of stability for centuries. But as the world changed, as towns grew, as money flowed, and as kings grew stronger, the intricate web of personal bonds that defined feudalism was slowly but surely unwound. The age of the sacred vow between a lord and his man gave way to the age of the state and the citizen, a new world forged in the long, slow twilight of the feudal order. In the grand tapestry of the feudal age, the threads that are most brightly colored and easiest to trace are almost always male. We speak of lords and kings, of knights and bishops, of vassals and serfs, often using the masculine pronoun as a universal stand-in. But to do so is to see only half of the picture, to ignore the vital, complex, and often overlooked world of the women who lived, worked, loved, and died within this rigid framework. From the powerful lady in her castle chamber to the hard-working peasant wife in her smoky hut, women were not passive observers of the feudal system. They were essential participants whose lives, though constrained by a patriarchal society, were filled with immense responsibility, quiet influence, and profound resilience. Let us first turn to the highest echelons of society, to the life of the noblewoman. The image of the lady of the castle is often one of romantic leisure, of a damsel in distress, waiting for a knight's rescue, or a serene figure engaged in embroidery, while listening to a troubadour's song. While these activities were part of her world, they belie the immense political and economic power she often wielded. For a woman born into the aristocracy, her life was defined from birth by her lineage and her potential for marriage. She was, first and foremost, a political asset. Her marriage was not a matter of personal choice or romantic affection. It was a strategic transaction arranged by her father or her feudal lord to forge an alliance, to acquire territory, or to settle a long-standing dispute. Her dowry, the land and wealth she brought to the marriage, was a key factor in these negotiations. She was a vessel for the transfer of property, and a weaver of political alliances through the children she was expected to bear. Her primary duty, upon which the entire future of her lineage rested, was to produce heirs, specifically a legitimate son, to inherit the fief. In an age of primitive medicine, childbirth was an extraordinarily dangerous and often fatal ordeal. The lady of the castle faced this trial repeatedly, knowing that her own life and the stability of her husband's domain hung in the balance. The failure to produce a male heir could lead to her being repudiated, cast aside, and sent to a convent, so that her husband could remarry in the hopes of securing his line. Yet, once married, the lady of the castle, the chatelaine, assumed a role of immense administrative responsibility. Her husband, the lord, was frequently absent. He might be away at war for months on end, attending the king's court, or engaged in the endless cycle of tournaments and hunting that defined the male aristocratic life. During these long absences, the lady was the de facto ruler of the fief. She was not simply minding the house. She was governing a complex economic and social enterprise. She was responsible for managing the castle's vast household, which could include hundreds of people. She had to oversee the food supplies, ensuring the storerooms were full and the kitchens were running. She managed the estate's finances, keeping accounts of rents, dues, and expenses. She was responsible for dispensing charity to the poor and for overseeing the religious life of the household. Furthermore, she was expected to be the military commander in her lord's absence. The historical records are filled with accounts of noblewomen who organized and led the defense of their castles during a siege. They would direct the garrison, ration the supplies, and negotiate with the enemy, showing a courage and strategic sense that was every bit the equal of their knightly husbands. A lady who could not command the respect of her household knights and defend her lord's interests was a liability. The serene embroiderer had to be ready, at a moment's notice, to become a hardened quartermaster and a defiant commander. The noble woman was also a powerful cultural force. It was in the household of the ladies, not the barracks of the knights, that the ideals of courtesy and courtly manners were cultivated. She oversaw the education of the young pages sent to her court, teaching them how to behave in polite society. And it was often the great ladies of the age, figures like the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, who were the primary patrons of the troubadours and poets who created the literature of courtly love, shaping the very ideals of chivalry that were meant to temper the violent impulses of the men around them. Now let us travel down the social ladder, from the stone walls of the castle to the wattle and daub hut of the peasant woman. Here, life was not a matter of politics and property, but of sheer, unremitting labor and survival. The peasant woman's existence was one of a double burden. She shared in the agricultural toil of the men, but she was also solely responsible for the domestic economy of the peasant household. During the busiest times of the agricultural year, such as the planting and the harvest, she worked alongside her husband in the fields, reaping the grain with a sickle, binding the sheaves, and gleaning the fallen stalks. This was back-breaking work, performed under the hot sun in addition to her daily responsibilities. And those daily responsibilities were immense. It was her job to tend the small vegetable garden, the croft, near their hut, which provided much of the family's food. She cared for the poultry, collecting the eggs that were a vital source of protein, and a small amount of cash if sold at market. She was responsible for milking the family cow or goat and churning the butter or making the cheese dot inside the dark, cramped hut. Her work was endless. She was the one who would grind the grain by hand with a heavy quern stone if the family could not afford the Lord's mill. She baked the heavy, dark bread that was the staple of their diet. She was the one who went to the woods to forage for nuts, berries, and firewood. She was responsible for brewing the family's small beer, a weak but essential ale that was often safer to drink than the local water. And, of course, she was responsible for child care, raising a large number of children in the hope that a few would survive the high rates of infant mortality. One of her most time-consuming and essential tasks was the production of textiles. From the raw wool sheared from the family's sheep, she would clean and card it, then spin it into thread using a simple drop spindle, or later, a spinning wheel. This thread would then be woven into a rough, coarse cloth, known as russet-on, a simple loom. It was from this cloth that she would hand-sew all of the family's clothing. This was a slow, laborious process that occupied nearly every spare moment. Legally and socially, the peasant woman was subordinate to her husband. Her property became his upon marriage. Yet within the village community, her status was more nuanced. Her economic contribution was not seen as secondary, but as absolutely vital to the survival of the household. The partnership between husband and wife was one of mutual dependency, a peasant economy in which both roles were essential. An older woman, particularly a widow who had inherited the right to work her husband's strips of land, could be a figure of considerable respect and informal authority within the village. She was often the keeper of traditional knowledge, the village midwife, and the expert in herbal remedies. Between these two poles of the lady and the peasant wife, other paths existed. In the growing towns, a merchant's or artisan's wife often worked alongside her husband in his shop or workshop. She might keep the accounts, manage the apprentices, and deal with customers. In many guilds, a widow was permitted to take over her husband's business and become a master craftswoman in her own right. For a smaller number of women, the church offered an alternative to marriage. Entering a convent as a nun offered a life of spiritual devotion, but for women from wealthy families, it could also offer an opportunity for education, artistic expression, and even significant administrative power as the abbess of a great convent. World of the feudal woman was a world of constraints, defined by the expectations of a society that viewed them primarily through the lens of their relationship to men as daughters, wives, and mothers. Yet within these constraints they carved out spheres of influence and power. They were managers, laborers, producers, defenders, and cultural patrons. They were the silent partners in the feudal enterprise, the unseen force that ran the households, raised the children, and performed the endless essential labor that allowed their world to function. Theirs is a story not of weakness, but of an enduring and fundamental strength. The knight, as we have seen, was the military and political pillar of the feudal system, but to see him only as a warrior, as a specialist in violence, is to miss the complex and often contradictory cultural code that grew up around him. This code, known to us as chivalry, was more than just a set of rules for battle. It was an entire ethos, a moral and social framework that sought to define what it meant to be a perfect knight. It was a fusion of martial prowess, Christian piety, and courtly elegance, an aspirational ideal that shaped the identity, literature, art, and social rituals of the European nobility for centuries. While the reality of a knight's behavior often fell brutally short of the ideal, the code of chivalry itself tells you a great deal about the values and anxieties of the world that created it. The origins of chivalry were born from a desire to control the endemic violence of the early feudal age. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the warrior class was largely untamed. Knights were often little more than well-armed warlords, preying upon the countryside, fighting endless private wars, and terrorizing the peasantry and even the church. In response, the church launched a series of movements known as the Peace of God and the Truce of God. The Peace of God sought to protect non-combatants clergy, peasants, women, and merchants from the violence of the warrior class, threatening knights with excommunication if they attacked the unarmed. The Truce of God went further, attempting to prohibit warfare altogether on certain holy days and seasons, such as Lent and Advent. These movements were only partially successful, but they represented the first major attempt to Christianize the warrior ethos, to argue that a knight's sword should be used not for personal gain, but in the service of justice and the defense of the weak. This Christianizing impulse was powerfully accelerated by the Crusades. The call to reclaim the holy land from Muslim rule gave the European knight a new, transcendent purpose. The Pope offered a path to salvation through warfare. A knight could now fulfill his martial nature and serve God at the same time. The crusading ideal created the concept of the Christian knight, the Miles Christi, or soldier of Christ. The great military orders founded during this period, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were a perfect fusion of these two ideals. They were monks who were also elite warriors, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, while dedicating their lives to the defense of Christendom. From these roots, the secular code of chivalry blossomed in the courts of the High Middle Ages. It was not a single written rule book, but a constellation of virtues that a knight was expected to embody. The first and most important of these was prus, or prowess. This was the fundamental requirement of skill, strength, and courage in combat. A knight who was not a formidable warrior was a failure, no matter his other virtues. This prowess was honed through constant training and displayed in both real battle and in the great medieval sport of the tournament. Early tournaments were chaotic and incredibly dangerous affairs known as the melee. Two teams of knights would line up and charge each other in a full-scale mock battle that raged across the countryside. The goal was to capture and ransom enemy knights. and serious injuries and deaths were common. Over time, in part due to the church's disapproval, the tournament became more ritualized, with the joust emerging as its centerpiece. The image of two knights charging each other with lances, trying to shatter their lance on the opponent's shield or to unhorse him, became the ultimate test of individual skill and the supreme expression of knightly prowess. The second great virtue was loyalty. This was the feudal cornerstone, the unwavering faithfulness a knight owed to the lord to whom he had sworn his oath of fealty. It also encompassed keeping one's word, telling the truth, and upholding justice. To be a disloyal knight, to betray one's lord, or to break a sworn promise was the deepest dishonor. The third virtue was largesse, or generosity. A good lord and a good knight were expected to be open-handed with their wealth. They were to be generous patrons, rewarding their loyal followers with gifts of money, horses, or armor, and giving alms to the poor and the church. This was not just a sign of Christian charity. It was also a display of status. A knight's honor was enhanced by his ability to be a river of gold to those around him, demonstrating that he valued honor and reputation more than mere material wealth. These core martial and social virtues were soon joined by a powerful new cultural force, one that emerged from the courts of southern France in the 12th century. Courtly love, promoted by influential noblewomen like Eleanor of Aquitaine, and spread by traveling poets and musicians known as troubadours. Courtly love was a complex and revolutionary code of romantic conduct. In its purest literary form, it imagined love as a kind of ennobling service. A knight would dedicate himself to a noble lady, who was almost always married and of a higher status. He would become her vassal of love, performing great deeds of arms in her honor, writing her poetry, and suffering the sweet sickness of unrequited love. His love for her was meant to inspire him to become a better knight and a more refined, courteous man. This ideal of courtly love had a profound civilizing effect on the rough, masculine world of the warrior. It taught the knight a new vocabulary of refinement, courtesy, courtoisie, and emotional sensitivity. It elevated the status of the noblewoman, casting her as an object of veneration and a judge of a man's worth. While the extent to which this literary ideal was actually practiced is a matter of historical debate, it undeniably transformed the culture of the aristocracy, introducing a new emphasis on elegance, grace, and romantic sentiment to navigate this complex world. A knight needed a way to be identified in the heat of battle or at a crowded tournament. From this need arose the science and art of heraldry. A knight would adopt a unique set of symbols and colors for his shield, his banner, and the surcoat worn over his armor. This coat of arms became his personal identifier, a visual representation of his lineage and his honor. The intricate rules of heraldry, with its lions and eagles, its chevrons and stripes, became a complex visual language, instantly communicating who was who on the battlefield. This, then, was the chivalric ideal, a warrior of great prowess, fiercely loyal and boundlessly generous, who served his lord, his god, and his lady with equal fervor. But we must always remember that this was an ideal, a beautiful and sophisticated myth that often masked a much uglier reality. The same knight who spoke poetry to his lady in the hall might lead the brutal sack of a town the next day. The chivalrous courtesy extended to a fellow nobleman did not apply to a peasant or a burgher. The code was a constant source of tension, a high standard against which the warrior class was measured, and very often found wanting. Yet the existence of the ideal itself was what mattered. Chivalry was an attempt by medieval society to civilize its own violent heart, to transform the feudal warrior into something nobler, and in doing so, it created one of the most enduring and powerful cultural legacies of the Middle Ages. Our journey through the age of feudalism has come to its end. We have walked the dangerous roads of a world without empire, witnessed the sacred vow that bound a knight to his lord, and stood within the cold, strong walls of the medieval castle. We have felt the rhythm of the seasons in the life of the peasant, and explored the tangled web of power that connected them all. We have seen how a system born of chaos created a unique and enduring order, and how that order, over centuries, slowly gave way to the forces of change. Feudalism was a world of stark contrasts. It was a system of profound, almost unimaginable inequality, where the fate of thousands was dependent on the will of a single lord, and the labor of an entire class of people was dedicated to supporting a small elite of warriors. Yet it was also a system built on a promise of protection, a network of mutual, if unequal, obligations that provided a measure of security in a deeply insecure time. It was an intensely personal system where loyalty was not to an abstract flag or nation, but to a specific person, a bond sealed by the clasp of hands. The world that feudalism created was one of deep faith, of brutal violence, of communal solidarity, and of stark hierarchy. It was a world where life was short, labor was hard, and one's place in the social order was largely determined by birth. But it was not a world without change or dynamism. In the cracks of this rigid system, the seeds of our own world were planted. In the new towns, a new kind of freedom was born. In the king's court, a new kind of state was forged. And in the peasant's demand for a wage, a new kind of economy was taking its first tentative steps. The legacy of this distant age is still with us, embedded in our language, our laws, and the ruins of castles that still dot our landscape. 2. Understand it is to understand the deep roots of our own society. It is to appreciate the long and difficult journey from a world held together by personal oaths to one held together by national laws. As we return from our journey, let the quiet of that distant time linger for a moment. The world of lords and vassals, of fiefs and manors has passed into history, but in its story we find a powerful reminder of the enduring human search for order, for security, and for a place to call home. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the past.